The country today is facing a tough decision to make, and perhaps not only the Philippines, but also the United States. We're facing an election. What should we consider as standards in choosing the next leader of the land? What kind of leadership does humanity need in the face of the different crises we have today? Psalm 72 tells us of the biblical vision and ideals of leadership. A kind of leadership we need to emulate in all kinds of communities we are in our families, faith communities, and even in society. Some scholars say that this passage is originally about the king. But despite that, we see in this psalm the responsibility and qualities that should characterize leadership. What are those? Righteousness, justice, and its result of well-being or shalom. The psalm is a prayer for the ruler, that the ruler's reign be just, righteous, and prosperous, and that's what we see in verses 1 to 7, and that the ruler's righteous rule be universally influential because of the ruler's compassion and readiness to help the oppressed, and that is in verses 8 to 14. The psalm closes with a prayer for the ruler's continued success in verses 15 to 17. So that's basically the structure of this psalm, 1 to 7, 8 to 14, 15 to 17. And perhaps you wonder, what about verses 18 to 20? Some say it's just an editorial comment to close the second book of Psalms. It's a reduction. But we can see also that it's very consistent with the theme of Psalm 72. Verses 1 to 7. Verses 1 to 7, the psalm begins with a prayer that the Lord's justice, mishpat, and righteousness, or tzedakah, particularly justice for the poor, to characterize the leader's reign. And these two, mishpat and tzedakah, form the classic word pair, or for those in biblical studies, hendiadys, of the Old Testament vision for Israel, and the supreme virtues of godly leadership. So justice and righteousness are characteristics of God that human leadership should emulate. In Psalms, we can see that God is presented to be the God of justice and the one who cares for the oppressed, the widow, and the orphans. And that's what we see in Psalm 72. And take note, it begins with a chiastic structure. Teach the king to judge with your righteousness, O God. Share with him your justice, your own justice, so that he will judge your people with justice and govern the oppressed with righteousness. So righteousness, justice, justice, righteousness. Chiastic structure. So we see that God is presented as the God who gives freedom, who gives justice and righteousness. He cares for the oppressed, the widows, and the orphans. He is the God who cares for the poorest of the poor. And not only that, in Psalm chapter 89, verses 14 to 15, justice and righteousness are spoken of as the foundation of the rule of God. That is very clear. And indeed, we can see that saving justice for the helpless is the mark of the rule of the reign of God. So justice and righteousness as very important characteristics of the rule of God. And in this section, particularly in verses 1 and 2, that this is prayed to come to the leader means that exercising justice and righteousness in leadership is a path of imitating God. Because God is the God of justice and righteousness, particularly justice for the poor, as God is the one who cares for the poor, the widows, and the orphans. Leadership that is just and righteous is a mark of imitating God. So if we really want to imitate God, we can also imitate God by being just and righteous in our leadership. In this regard, we can say that the prayer of Psalm 72 is very consistent with that biblical vision of godlike leadership. It advances the conviction that maintenance of justice and righteousness is the primary responsibility of leader before God and before the community. Again, God's justice and righteousness are characteristics that human leadership must reflect. The leader's righteousness should carry out God's righteousness. And take note that in verse 2, the people are spoken of as God's people. May the land enjoy prosperity. May it experience righteousness. We can see here, so that He will rule over your people with justice. The people are spoken of as God's people. Both the attributes, justice and righteousness, and the people belong to God and not to the human leader. What does it mean? The leader is merely a steward of God's people and is entrusted to rule as agent of God's justice and righteousness. The people do not belong to the leader. The people belong to God. And as God's steward, the leader is to be dependent upon God and accountable to God for the use of His power. The people, including the weak ones, must never be utilized for the purposes of the leader. So here, the ruler is reminded and commissioned to care for the weak through acting with decisive faithfulness. So we see here an invitation and a challenge for every leader to partner with God and with the community in making the world as a place of God's justice and righteousness. That the people belongs to God also means that the people also have access to God and can become vehicles of wisdom from God. In many human kind of leadership, the leaders are attentive only to their own voice. But here, the people also belongs to God. They also have a direct access to God. In Protestant theology, we have what we call as the priesthood of all the believers. It means that every human being, particularly all believers, have a direct access to God. It means that the leader also needs to be attentive to the wisdom that comes from the people, and that the leadership must be sensitive and responsive to the voices from below. Is this the kind of leadership we see around us and the one we practice? That we are also sensitive to the voices of the people around us? There are many times that we are so attentive only to our own voices and we fail to be sensitive, much more to be responsive to the voices of the people. And then in verse 3, it states, what happens when human leadership conforms to this model of just and righteous leadership? What is it? The mountains will bring forth shalom, and the mountains will bring forth tzedakah, righteousness. From this passage, we see that the result of justice and righteousness is well-being, not only for humanity, but also for the earth. When there is justice in the land, the earth itself participates towards experiencing shalom. So Walter Brueggemann is correct in saying that the full functioning of creation is dependent on the serious practice of social justice. Just and righteous leadership brings well-being to all the people and the land. This flourishing of the land is very meaningful to to an agricultural society like Israel. In common with many agrarian economies like the Philippines, for the ancient Israelites, food and soil represent the most universal and foundational actualization of justice. Where there is food and soil, there is justice. When there is no food, there is no soil, there is no justice. And this is a biblical vision of shalom. A vision that embraces the notion of the restoration of justice, truth, and righteousness. Creation will be restored to justice, righteousness, and truth. So we see here that human leadership that reflects God's justice and righteousness also results to the well-being of the earth. And human leadership that reflects God's justice and righteousness becomes a channel of life for the people. And that's what we see in verses 4 to 6. It becomes a channel of life for the people and the land. In verse 4, it re-emphasizes justice for the poor as a hallmark of godly leadership. But wait, there is something more. What is it? Aside from the prayer for the king to judge the poor fairly and to help the needy, in verse 4, the psalmist also prays that the leader do something decisive towards those who take advantage of the needy. Read what is in verse 4. What do we see? May the king judge the poor fairly. May he help the needy and defeat their oppressors. May your people worship you as long as the sun shines. That is very clear in verse 4. May he defeat the oppressors. As God's representative and agents of divine justice, godly leaders know that to defend the weak, something decisive must be done to the powerful oppressors. It is enough for evil to prosper that godly persons do nothing. What are we going to do if we see something wrong around us? Verse 4 is very clear. A godly leader defends the poor, and a godly leader does decisive things against the oppressor. The text, however, doesn't justify a violent act, but it justifies that something must be done to stop them, to stop the oppressors from oppressing the needy ones. And this kind of just leadership, who defends the poor and defeats the oppressors, should last long. And this is the reason why we hear in verses 5 to 7, a prayer for the leader's long life, together with a prayer that the leader be like a life-giving rain that waters the earth. May your people worship you as long as the sun shines, as long as the moon gives light, for ages to come. May the king be like rain on the fields, like showers falling on the land. May righteousness flourish in his lifetime, and may prosperity last as long as the moon gives light. Human leadership that reflects the justice of God becomes a channel of life for the people and the land. And as long as the leadership is responsive to the ideals of God, righteousness and well-being flourish. These verses tell us that we need leaders who uphold justice and common good, especially for the poor and the needy ones. A just and righteous leadership is a channel of shalom for the people and the land. And then in verses 8 to 14, if the preceding verses 1 to 7, express a hope about the length of just and righteous leadership and its result of shalom, verses 8 to 14 contain a prayer that this just leadership receives worldwide influence. Read what is in verses 8 to 11. His kingdom will reach from sea to sea, from the Euphrates to the ends of the earth. The people of the desert will bow down before him. His enemies will throw themselves to the ground. The kings of Spain and of the islands will offer him gifts. The kings of Arabia and Ethiopia will bring him offerings. All kings will bow down before him. All nations will serve him. Some readers are perhaps alarmed by the rhetoric of this passage. They say that these verses also advances a kind of violent and militaristic perspective. That this king who is just and righteous will be like oppressor or conqueror to others. And I can say such is not the case. Yes, the psalmist prays that this leader to be in a position of decisive leadership in the world. But does the text say that the people of other nations will recognize him because of his coercion or bullying and military might, just like other superpowers? 8 to 11 is the request for worldwide influence. And the basis or reason is given in verses 12 to 14. What is the reason? The reason is this ruler and influential leadership the ruler is influentially global because this leader is committed to empower the weak. The opening verse of the section in verse 12 to 14 for those with Hebrew begins with ki, which can either be a causative, because, or emphasis, indeed. So, why do we have the prayer for worldwide acclaim or influence? The reason is given in verses 12 to 14. What is it? The basis for the acknowledgement of other nations, wished for in verses 8 to 11, is because of the leader's compassion and decisive action to help the oppressed. That is what we see in verses 12 to 14. It is worth noting that in this section, different words are used to refer to those who are in need. Needy, or ebyon in Hebrew, and that is used 3 times in this section. We also have here ebyonim, children of the needy ones, or children of the weak or of the poor. And that is how it is translated in NIV. Poor of the people in New Revised Standard Version. We also have here afflicted, ani, in verse 12. Weak or dull. So what we have here, we see many words used to refer to the poor, the disadvantaged, the downtrodden. And in that context, the leader is portrayed as one who is attentive and responsive to the plight of the disadvantaged, showing compassion on those without resources, and making decisive action to deliver them from further violence and oppression. That's what we have in verse 14. In this context, we see a very powerful description of what it means to lead with justice and righteousness, and what constitutes God's order for His community. What is it? deliverance of the needy and poor, freedom from oppression and violence. This kind of leadership stands in sharp contrast with those in governance, even in politics and inside the faith communities, who have little sympathy with the needy ones in their midst. It is also important to remember that the two preceding Psalms, chapter 70 and chapter 71, have presented God as the one who delivers the poor, chapter 70, verse 5, and the one who rescues, chapter 71. Aside from that, in other Psalms, God is acknowledged in Israel's history as the one who is attentive to the cry of the needy ones. Psalm chapter 22, verse 24, chapter 35, verse 10. And the effect of such kind of presentation is to reinforce the image of God as someone who has a special concern for those in the margins. Thereby, it serves as a model for those in power. Leaders must image God or must reflect the image of God in listening and in His acting. God is sensitive, attentive, and responsive to the cry of the weak. So leaders must image God in His listening and in His acting. I've taken that from the commentary of John Goldingay, his commentary on Psalms. So like God, leaders must empower the powerless and must attend to the needs of the downtrodden. Aside from that, we also see in verse 14 a statement that serves as a critique to the existing social conditions that contribute to the presence of poverty. What is it? In verse 14, it affirms that the needy people are victims of violence and oppression. Some are wealthy because they oppress the poor, and their wealth comes from oppression of the poor. Conversely, some are poor because they have been victimized by the wealthy ones. And that is why we see here that the godly leader needs to be attentive and responsive to the cry of the poor, just like God. And in the face of such injustice and oppression, the leader has to take action to restore the order of the society and the lives of the victims. Listen to the words in verse 14. See? There's it. He rescues them from oppression and violence. That is very important. As someone who represents God's concern for the oppressed, the leader must reflect godly concern and must not give in to the temptation of power. We know that absolute power corrupts. Above all, the godly leader must be the advocate and support of the weak and the oppressed. Here we see, also in the second column of verse 14, what in the leader's mind is very important. What is it? Is it power? What is important for the leader? Is it wealth? Is it to accumulate power and to perpetuate themselves in power? What for the leader's mind is important? What is it? The lives of the poor are precious to him. Here we see the opposite of the usual attitude seen in ungodly leadership that merely looks at the poor from the perspective of political and economic gain. During election time, suddenly, all the candidates become pro-poor. one with them, coming from their ranks. Is that so? All of a sudden. That's why there is a kind of parody or satire in one of the gag shows in the Philippines. Why only for the poor? What about us, the rich? I haven't heard any candidate saying that he is pro-rich. How come? Don't we have the rights also? Don't we have our needs? You see? But here, the lives of the poor are precious to the sight of the leader. For this leader, it is neither to use the poor as statistics, nor to romanticize the poor for the benefit of those in political and religious power. This is a leadership that does not rule by coercion, by manipulation, one that does not advance its own interests, but leads with compassion and champions the cause of the marginalized and the weak. In a sense, this is a penetrating critique of any unjust leadership and structures that perpetuate in the land at home with injustice. We see lots of injustice and unrighteousness around us. So in this sense, Psalm 72 offers a vision of the rule of God that every leader needs to emulate. Here is a very powerful description of what it means to lead with justice and righteousness. This is from John Scullion. So in this regard, we can say, like God, leaders must empower the powerless and must attend to the needs of the downtrodden. Our lifestyle and leadership in churches, organizations, and institutions must be embodiment of the just and righteous rule of God, who is sensitive, attentive, and responsive to the needs and cries of the weak. How can we make that practical? Are we attentive, sensitive, and responsive to the cries of those under us, the needy ones around us? Do we image God in our listening and in our acting? In our meetings or in our conversation with the people around us, with the weak? Are we really present? Or our minds are elsewhere? In our meetings, do we really pay attention and listen to the voices of the people? Sometimes it is sad that even during our meetings, our minds are so busy. We don't really listen. In what sense? We text, how are you? Where na you? Dito na mi? Waiting for this agony to end? Are we really attentive? Are we really sensitive? Do we really listen? So how can we respond to the needs of the people if we don't pay attention to them? We need to image God in our listening and in our acting. Then after that, we see concluding challenges and responsibilities. Verses 15 to 17 serve as a fitting summary to this psalm, with a final repetition for the ruler's long and prosperous reign. This is also a petition that gifts from other nations be given to him, and a challenge for the people to continue to pray for him. Verse 16 takes the idea of the preceding verses, especially verse 3, that says that the blessings through this leader be felt in all aspects of life, including the realms of nature. Verse 17 again prays for the length of this leadership, and that it may become a channel of blessings for other nations. So we see that verses 15 to 17 serve as a summary or as a recapitulation or repetition of the concerns expressed in the previous verses. Now, perhaps we need to ask, what then would be the function of this vision of godly leadership for the community of faith reading it? Robert Alter's question is worth pondering. What would the world look like, the psalmist explicitly asks, if you imagine a ruler governing not by coercion, but by compassion and unwavering equity, who did not exploit the weak and champion them? We see that to reflect God's justice and righteousness, the leader must not use leadership as an element of control to advance one's own interests or even to benefit the powerful, but as an instrument to empower the powerless. As the text shows, God's blessings of life and shalom is experienced when there is justice. One commentator states, when the king gives the life of God's justice to the people, then the blessings of fertile land and far-reaching power follow. From this perspective, justice is indeed a life-enhancing activity. When there is justice and righteousness in leadership, the people and the land will experience life. When the leader leads with justice and righteousness, true salvation is experienced. A kind of salvation that embraces the whole of creation. And take note, let's all remember that this is a prayer. And this prayer, every time it is uttered, I can say it has a world-making capacity. Whenever it is prayed, the person praying engages in an act of embracing an alternative future, an alternative vision, a vision of a world that is shaped by the reign of the God of justice and righteousness. So whenever this prayer is uttered, the person praying expresses a kind of hope, that his hope is shaped not by the realities around, but by this hope based on that kind of faith in God. The very utterance of this song gives hope and encouragement, even to those who feel neglected and denied equal access to public good and opportunity. When we see that life seems unjust, when we see lots of injustice and unrighteousness around us, during those moments that we begin to lose hope, this song reminds us that the God of justice and righteousness listens to our cry, the one anyone can turn to when life seems unjust. Come to God, therefore. He is the God who listens. He is the God who attends. He is the God who empowers the weak and the marginalized. So when we do that, and when this prayer is prayed, it evokes among the people and the leaders the need to pray for and work for this kind of just leadership to dawn upon the land. Some say that prayer is a form of escape. But we can see here that far from being an escapist exercise, prayer is here as a form of hope, a form of engagement with God and with the concerns of the world, so that the world may become a world under the rule of God. Uttering a prayer like this involves a challenge to live according to its ideals and construct a social reality consistent with the social vision it offers. I can say that the very utterance of this prayer is a kind of social criticism and serves as a seedbed for social transformation. In the words of Karl Barth, to clasp the hands in prayer is the beginning of an uprising against the disorder of the world. Lastly, that this prayer is a prayer uttered before God is in itself a reminder and challenges for the people to be always prayerful, to be always dependent on God, and be vigilant to help the weak among us, and be caring also for the world around us. So we see here a wonderful relationship between prayer and justice, between spirituality and the work of righteousness. So in a sense, we see here a kind of vision, a holistic vision. And this is what we have here at ATS. Part of our ethos here at ATS is transformation. And that is expounded in our mission statement, in our vision statement, so that all of us become a channel of transformation, godly transformation in Asia and beyond. Hence, we can see that the conclusion of chapter 72 in verses 18 to 20, while may be a latter addition due to its position as a conclusion to the second part of the Psalms, it may not be an original part of the prayer in Psalm 72. However, it is also very consistent with the theme of verses 1 to 17, because it expresses a recognition of faith to God, the God who is really capable of doing marvelous things. Praise the Lord! The God of Israel, He alone does these wonderful things. Praise His glorious name forever. True rule belongs only to God. And indeed, human leadership must really be a reflection of this rule by God, whose name is to be glorified, whose reign we pray to come, whose will belong to be done on earth as it is in heaven. Amen.